Peter Brown, do you accept, therefore, that it's likely that prices will go up to consumers as a result of Brexit?
Well, no, I think exactly the opposite. Because at the moment, as my Lord says, there are high tariffs from the European Union on certain agricultural goods. And developing countries, for instance, have to pay very, very high tariffs, which we could, of course, if we were independent, do away with. And the idea that we have to impose tariffs on the EU imports just because they might impose it on our exports is for the birds.
If we're going to preserve standards, for example, things like high environmental standards, or indeed concerns about foreign labour and the type of conditions that's kept in, that will mean that we will have to have tariffs, won't it?
Well, there's no need for us to have tariffs. What you were talking about there is making sure that food is produced properly, and that's an issue worldwide, not just something to the European Union.
Well, the trouble is that if we go for non-tariffs altogether, and this report is not just about tariffs, it's around non-tariff barriers as well, getting stuff through ports, particularly perishable goods, and the efficiency of those supply chains. But if we go for no tariffs whatsoever, that's absolutely feasible, as Mr. Bone says, but we have to do that for the rest of the world. And the WTO does not like then to have restrictions like on animal welfare and all the environmental concerns that the government also wants. So there's a problem there. But the main issue is that came across from industry is that government needs to make up its mind. There's not a lot of time there, and we need to get a lot of these systems in place. That's the real issue. As
a Lord and Liberal Democrat, you presumably support the idea of having another referendum. I mean, you think that we'd make a bit of a mistake?
Well, as Liberal Democrats, I mean, I chair this committee absolutely neutrally.
Sure,
as a Liberal Democrat, then it seems to me logical that the people should have a final say on the type of Brexit that we have. That's difficult. Even I dread the thought of going through all the divisiveness that was caused in the country at the first referendum.
And you've been voting in these 14 defeats of the government?
Yes, as a member of the Lords, I've been voting, and I think for all those 14 amendments that are not wrecking amendments in any way, they're just about the shape of Brexit, they're not against Brexit, then yes, I've been a part of those votes.
I mean, the Daily Mail says you and others are traitors in ermine, and do you agree with that?
No, I don't. First of all, it's 323 days until we leave the EU, which is to be celebrated. The Lords is doing its job. Do I disagree with many of the amendments that are going to come back to the Commons? Yes, I do, but that's their constitutional function. I do think the one thing the Lords have to be slightly careful on, this is not a normal situation. We had a referendum and we let the people decide the outcome, and that is pretty unique, and therefore I think the Lords should be careful about trying to change the original decision, and some of those amendments come pretty close to it.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, except that I don't think any of the Lords, if the Lords really wanted to be difficult, it could have voted at second reading and thrown the bill out completely. It voted for the Brexit bill itself, the Article 50 bill. It's not rejected the withdrawal bill. It's just made very strong opinions about what Brexit would look like. But in the end, yes, the Commons will decide.
I mean, Peter, do you think some of the things that the Lords have put back into the legislation are actually incompatible with the vote in the referendum in 2016?
Well, I think, for instance, going back into the single market, for instance, is something that was clearly debated in the referendum, and people decided that we want to come out and we want to come out of the single market. That was part of the general debate.
It wasn't on the ballot paper.
No, but it was, yeah, but you couldn't have the long list. We know what basically it came to ending free movement, making our own laws in our own country, not spending billions of pounds in the EU. And one of the issues that came up was the single market, and both sides were very clear on it. If the people vote to come out, we're coming out of the single market. Therefore, I think the Lords have overstepped it on that amendment. But other amendments are quite reasonable. The ones about the sifting committee and all that should be looked at carefully by the Commons.
Yeah, but I don't think it was as clear about that as the single market. I think the sort of issues that there were around there were certainly around migration was a major one, and of course the single market includes mobility of people. So yes, it certainly impinged on that, but there was no description, in fact multiple descriptions of what Brexit meant, and that's really why Parliament, least as the representation of the people, should then have a final view on what that shape is, and hopefully with the people as well.
So, I mean,
the government didn't even win a majority in an election that followed it. So, I mean, things like Salisbury Convention, all those sort of things really don't work at the moment.
Well, the one I thought that everybody had decided on the referendum that this was it. There was a terrific debate. It was one of the best democratic things, and the result was very clear. But you can't, because you didn't get the answer you like, go back and ask for another referendum.
But you could say that, for example, Norway is not in the European Union. Norway could be a stop which people voted for.
But what you have to look at, as long as you don't break the fundamental principles that were discussed in the referendum, ones I've just said about free movement, and that's why the single market ends, because you couldn't end free movement. So if you don't break those ones, all the other things quite rightly should be debated by Parliament and are. I just think that on some of them, the Lords overstepped. They forgot that the people had decided on those particular issues.
Well, the Lords say in the end, look, the decision's going to be taken in the Commons. How likely is it, do you think, that every single thing that the Lords have put into the legislation will be removed by the Commons? I mean, isn't that
I think that's very unlikely, because on some of the points, some of the amendments are very sensible ones about the number of days between a statutory instrument has to be looked at. And those things the Commons should look. But the big ticket items, which are party political, that I assume the Commons will vote the way it did originally and throw them back to the Lords. And there may be a little bit of toing and froing, but I think, as what the Lord said, they will eventually accept it.
Yeah, but in many ways, it's, as we all know, it's extremely non-party political in all sorts of ways. I mean, the single market vote that you mentioned in the Lords, I don't think any of us expected would be a win, and yet it was all around, particularly Labour peers.
Well, they didn't support their leader.
Conservatives working the other way.
What do you say to your colleagues who are saying time to reform the Lords or get rid of them?
Every time the Lords says something the Commons doesn't like, people in the Commons say it's time to reform the Lords. I mean, I think there are strong arguments for some reform of the Lords, but I think we'd accept that. But the idea we should do away with the Lords because they happen to be disagreeing with the Commons, actually, being a revising chamber, that's exactly what and they're asking us. They're not challenging us. They're asking us to look at it again, and that's what we're doing.
And of course, being a Liberal Democrat, I'm heavily in favour of reform of the Lords. If not
but I mean, given that, do you feel a bit embarrassed? You know, overrepresented and unelected?
No, not at all, because we're underrepresented in the House of Commons, and it is the system it is at the minute. Liberal Democrats, as part of the coalition, wanted to reform the Lords, and indeed, if we had done and the way we would, we'd be less represented in the second chamber now. So there's a lot of ironies around this, isn't there?
OK, thank you both very much indeed.